I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road, let's camera action already.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to kind of talk to you. And when I say pleasure, that might be sound kind of a leap of faith, because given the circumstances of power outages and health outages and even just threats to our very existence on the planet. But I'm still lifting up the fact that it is a pleasure to kind of be in touch and to be involved and to share information with people, and for people to commune, to not just give up and to keep hope. And in fact, today with Madeline Baranowski and Linda Coleman, and I'm not sure if Teacher will be speaking, but her presence is here, and Leroy Ferry, but primarily Madeline and Linda. What is the Institutional Review Board? What does health equity mean? What does research mean? What is just being able to kind of understand our role in clinical trials and making this a better place? Literally, as we talk about vaccines, and there's some controversy about vaccines, but even for a vaccine to reach the market, something called this IRB, Institutional Review Board, kind of is important. People forget that this is a structure that we're going to talk about today that really impacts your daily life and future generations. And I'm not being facetious, but your daily life right now and future generations. So Madeline and Linda, welcome, and kind of kick us off with the PowerPoint. And I think the audience will find it, I know the audience will find it instrumental and informative, because this is the era, this is a key opportunity for what is advancing healthcare through a community and university partnership and research look like. And it's not an Ivy League or Ivy Tower endeavor. This is a real deal, separate from COVID, but even more now with COVID accentuating and emphasizing the fact that we are in the midst of a public health crisis, but there will be other public health crises. And how to minimize the future is why we're doing this show today. To minimize the future impact of death on people is literally, this is a life and death show for the next 52 minutes. And I just want to thank you again, Madeline and Linda, for coming to my rescue this morning and giving me some hope, because information is indeed power. So I think Madeline would like to kick us off, or Linda, have you guys tossed a coin in terms of who's going to start first?
I think Madeline gets to start first.
All right, Madeline.
Tom, thank you so much for having us. And you're absolutely right. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but when any family member gets sick, even if it's not in a pandemic, it's a crisis for that family. So even when there wasn't a pandemic, with cancer and diabetes and heart disease, all of those require advancements in healthcare to be sure we can deliver the best health and innovative treatments to people. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the way that's advanced through the protection of partnerships with people in the community who work with the researchers and the investigators. Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you first.
Okay, you want me to start? Okay.
Yeah, please.
So good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and start with our presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is an institutional review board, an IRB, and also what is a human research protection program, and so what does all that mean? So as Madeline started off by discussing, research is really very, very necessary to improve healthcare and to find potential treatments and cures. So without, research, and then when I say research, it's animal research, it's all the things, human research, everything that we do is really important for finding potential cures and treatments. But the challenge, though, is that we need to make sure that we ensure the ethical protection of people involved in those types of involved in research studies. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Yale's institutional, our human research protection program, but just so you're aware, universities across the country have human research protection programs or IRBs, or a lot of universities do research. And so this is not just a Yale focused presentation. Although I'm talking about Yale, I just want you to be aware that when we're talking about this conversation, it's something that is in the United States. It's in Canada, around the world, everywhere. There are equivalents of human research protection programs generally. It's just they may be called something different, but that's really what it's all about. So an institutional review board in the United States might be called an ethics committee in another country, a research ethics board in Canada, those kinds of things. So kind of keep that in mind. But what does the Yale Human Research Protection Program, what is that all about? So we ensure the rights and welfare of human subjects participating in research. We promote excellence in the conduct of human subjects research, and we advance scientific knowledge and quality of research. So that's there's a lot of information there. So in terms of just generally, it takes a community to improve healthcare. So I'm not sure if Madeline, you wanted to cover this slide or not, or want me to do this one?
We want to unmute Marilyn. Marilyn is muted.
Madeline, you are unmuted.
Sorry. We can go so far with animal research, but eventually we need to test new medications and vaccines on people because they will be the ones that have to use the vaccines and the medication. And so that is the part of the human subjects research that we want to provide as many protections as possible. We can't remove all risks, right? But we try to mitigate as many as we can. And researchers need oversight in that and a review to be certain that nothing is missed. And that's where the Human Research Protection Program comes in and the IRB comes in. And in addition, the federal government has regulations. The FDA has regulations that help us to follow steps to protect human subjects.
And Madeline, if I can just jump in, it's just so important what you just mentioned because people hear about the government, they hear about perhaps Food and Drug Administration, they may know about the Federal Communications Commission, they may know about the Fed in terms of regulating our monetary policy. But this IRB thing, I only found out about it maybe a year ago when I participated in a program with CARE, and it's just so insightful that it's true, for me, it's true democracy on the ground. So I'm just glad you emphasized that point.
So this next slide is we can't go into this, unfortunately, today. We could probably spend hours talking about some of these things. Sometimes when I have done classes on this, we look at the history of how do we get here. Madeline mentioned, federal regulations, laws, regulations, guidelines, and human research standards that exist. We'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the presentation, but how did we get here? So we all know about the Nuremberg Code or the Nazi experiments during World War II. We know a lot of people have heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study. There's so many between them. World War II and at the time of the end of the Tuskegee syphilis study, I could probably add, dozens and dozens of ethical issues or cases or situations where there was problematic research happening, not just only in the United States, but we could look to other countries around the world as well. And so this is just a really good snapshot of some of the history that led us here. And we're going to talk a little bit next about the Belmont Report and some of the ethical principles and kind of how the evolution of the regulations occurred, in the 70s. So I'm having a little difficulty with my computer here, so I apologize. I'm not quite sure, so just give me just a moment here.
Linda, I'm just glad that you have power and you're able to access your computer. I am able to
do this. Here we go. Okay, here we go. So one of the things is that's really important is that what came out of a lot of the issues that occurred up into the early 1970s, in particular the Tuskegee syphilis study, was this creation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And so that occurred in 1974. And so because of the National Research Act was enacted by the 93rd United States Congress and signed into law by President Nixon on July 12, 1974. So there were a series of hearings, congressional hearings that occurred, and they were directed by Senator Edward Kennedy. And so based on what happened there really helped to establish our modern, IRB system. So one of the famous publications that came out of that was the 1978 Belmont Report. And it is considered a standard declaration of ethical principles for research, not only in the United States, but for the rest of the world. And there's 3 principles that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to outline on a higher level what those are. Madeline will kind of jump in and talk a little bit more specifically. But those 3 principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And just to kind of just emphasize again that the Belmont Report is a guiding principle, and it provides the framework that guides the resolution of ethical problems arising from research involving human participants, and is considered comprehensive and integral for evaluating research. And so just again, it's not just an academic exercise, they put this together. When the IRB is doing their deliberation, whatever IRB it is, lots of times the IRB will talk about things like respect for persons and consent, and talk about what justice and those kinds of terms. So it's not just words on a page, they really mean something.
Linda, if I might, just before you go to the next slide, the word beneficence. Mm-hmm. I consider myself to be a wordsmith, and I know a lot of words, but I got to tell you, I'm not sure I'm going to pass this SAT test.
You will.
Well, by the end of this presentation. But beneficence, give me a kind of a layperson. What's the connotation there?
Well, the BENE means good. So, like, if you think about maleficence and beneficence, so the BENE part of it is a positive word, means good doing. So beneficence is a positive word, I would say, in the sense that you're trying to do the right thing. So in this case, this slide I have up here, I'll just go to the middle. Beneficence, basically the IRB has to ensure that there's a favorable, the risks and the benefits are looked at very closely, and there needs to be a favorable risk-benefit ratio, and it must be designed to kind of maximize the benefit, the positive aspects, and to minimize, as Madeline mentioned, research is not completely without risk, but you need to sort of minimize that risk. And so in the context of research, we're talking about things like, the science, and does it have merit, and why are you doing this, and who are you including in the research? So if you really want to do a deeper dive on this conversation, when we talk about things like the importance of having different groups represented in research, okay, and ensuring that there's sound science. How can you have sound science, right? And how can you fulfill this obligation, this beneficence, if you don't do that? Because then you don't, then perhaps that, downstream, when those drugs get on the market, they may, be harmful to some populations and beneficial to the others. So I know that that's really a conversation that's really integral to what's the conversation today in terms of research. So that's how I talk about beneficence.
Thank you.
Okay, so respect for persons, it's just really fundamental that research participants have to have the ability to make voluntary decisions about being in the research, right? You don't want to be paternalistic, maternalistic, whatever word you want to use there, and just make assumptions. You want to give people information, because they're smart people. They can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to participate in research or not. And so that's the concept of respect for persons, that you respect and you give them information, they can make informed decisions. And then justice gets into this issue of equitable selection in research, which is different from what I talked about previously about scientific benefit and merit and that kind of thing. The science behind the importance of having populations represented, that's one piece of it. On the justice side, though, you really want to make sure that people have opportunities to participate in research, right? But you also don't want to exploit them either, and sort of use tactics to, quote, incentivize or coerce people being into research either. So there's a fine line between making sure you are making sure that people are represented in studies versus trying to go after them or target them in an inappropriate way in order to get them into research. As you can probably think from history, we've had many examples where maybe the science was, they really wanted to study something that was really important, but yet the measures they took to recruit were completely inappropriate. Or they didn't have informed consent. And so that's really why IRBs exist today. So I don't know, Madeline, I know you have some additional slides here, so I'll let you cover these next 3 slides since these are really ones that you wanted to kind of highlight.
All right, as Linda said, participation in research must be voluntary. That's something that came out of not only the regulations, but in the application of ethics, that a person can't be caught up in research without knowing what's going to happen to them and what risks they're taking. And that's why we consider research participants as volunteers who are actually part of the research mission. They are as important and in many ways more important than the investigators, because without them, we can't go further. We can't identify whether a medication works or a vaccine works. And we must guarantee, and that's the job of the IRB and the Human Research Protection Program, that there's no loss in care for not participating. That is, they can't be put in a position where they're forced or they feel as though they're forced to participate. We can talk further about that later. And so one way to do that is through informed consent. And informed consent is where they clearly know what the risks are. And it has to be described in a way that they understand and how it impacts them. There are expert protections for vulnerable subjects or participants. Children, for example, those with limited cognitive ability to understand. Sometimes persons who don't speak English as a first language and the consent isn't translated. We look very carefully at to be sure they understand. Prisoners have been abused in research before, and so there are many extra protections for them and other populations. And then you talked about, Tom, or asked about beneficence. So on the next slide, beneficence is looking at a risk-benefit balance. So beneficence is doing good, and we know physicians and nurses take an oath to care for subjects or their patients. In research, sometimes the care can't be guaranteed to help. And so there, the idea is that there must be enough known to know that it tips in favor of doing good. It can't be just for science alone without an idea that in the end, some good will come out of it. Sometimes not for the individual, but rather for the discovery that will help other people in the future. And so people who take medication for the first time, that it's never been given to a human before, they're taking a risk. Mm-hmm. And even though they might not benefit, they're told that what we learn might benefit others in the future. And there has to be enough protection in place for monitoring and follow-up of the people who are brave enough to do that.
Madeline, just repeat what you've just said there. That point, I think people just don't really understand. It's because sometimes it's intimidating to participate, but the potential benefit to society, and you just repeat what you just said. I guess I want people to kind of hear that again.
I think sometimes we get so caught up in our research and wanting to do research that we forget that the participants are essential, because very often the very first time a drug is tried on humans or a vaccine is tried on humans, the very first time, there can be no guarantee that we even know all the risks that are there or that it'll work. And so those are very brave participants who are contributing, and they're contributing to the greater good, right? But the IRB and the HRPP work very hard to be sure that we know as much as possible and we follow the participants as closely as possible and take care of them if there are bad side effects. And so those are studies that are called phase 1 studies. By the time we get to the later phases, investigators have a better idea of what the risks are, and they're going to describe them carefully.
Is it fair to say, Linda and Madeline, that we hear about the vaccines that might soon be on the market? They've gone through human trials already?
Certainly the one that's being considered to open here, the Pfizer vaccine, that has been through, that was tested in Germany. It's been tested around in the United States as well in early trials. And now there is an understanding of how people have reacted to it. Still, it's in the earliest phases, and they can't guarantee how long it will work or whether it works for everyone in the same way. They're not going to know all of that, but it isn't coming as a first in human. So when drugs are first in human, that's when the risks are the most unknown.
But I would just, go ahead. I was just going to say too what Madeline, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to say too that what's really important is that when you're designing a study, that there are measures in place to monitor things that happen to subjects, research participants along the way. So they're not just going to just go from start a study and end a study and say, well, it's okay that there were, quote, adverse events or safety issues that occurred. There's a threshold, right? So they're going to really pay attention to it very, very closely. And if there's something that's not acceptable, right, then either the IRB and or the investigator or the sponsor or everyone will agree that we need to stop the study. So it's really everyone has this responsibility to really pay really close attention to these types of studies. So it's not so that we are really minimizing harm or risk to participants. I think I can't emphasize that enough. So Madeline, maybe you might want to.
Right. And one other thing I'll say, when a big pharmacology company does it, like Pfizer or BMS, one of the other things the university looks at and the HRPP and the IRB look at is being sure there's a part that says in case of injury, in case there are bad side effects, that the participants have their care paid for and they're going to be followed and taken care of. So there's an appreciation that participants are an essential part of the research. And then justice, Linda talked about in the next slide, and this is equal opportunity to participate in research. So for example, we say to researchers, you have to translate your consent form into Spanish, especially in New Haven, because we have many of our citizens speak Spanish. And it wouldn't be fair to exclude them from the opportunity just because we didn't translate a consent form. Equal opportunity to benefit. I'm going to show you 2 slides, the next 2. So the people for whom the medication is tested should also then benefit when the medication comes out or the vaccine. And I'll give you an example. If, say, we test the vaccine on participants, but then when the vaccine comes out, it's so expensive that that community couldn't pay for it, that would be injustice. And if you remember, it was President Obama who apologized for research that didn't happen on his watch, that happened years before that in Guatemala, where a vaccine on children was tested, but then they couldn't afford to take the vaccine after the research had gone forward to show that it worked. So the next slide shows what we expect, and we're going to look for to be sure that the medication is available at a reasonable cost for the participants who took the medication. This often happens in cancer research, where the participants take the medication and it's new, they're not sure, but it does work. And then it costs so much they couldn't afford it. So we look to be sure that they can continue on their medication if it's helping them without cost, because they volunteered to advance the science of this medication. So that's what justice means, and that's what we look at.
Madeline and Linda, if I might just jump in terms of the word justice and economic justice, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. Are you saying that once the vaccine for COVID becomes available, it should be affordable?
Should have access. Yeah,
Yes.
definitely access.
That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
That's right. Because it wouldn't be fair to have a community of volunteers whose family then couldn't afford the vaccine when it finally is shown to work because those volunteers participated.
But what about the public?
It should be affordable.
What about, should it be affordable to the general public as well?
Exactly. Exactly. Because it's the general public that's going to be participating to test the vaccine.
I think that's definitely come up recently. There's been a lot of conversation about that, even between or among countries. So, for example, there's been some testing done in Europe, and there was some discussion about where that drug or the vaccine or potential treatment would be available after, if it came to market and was shown to be effective. And again, there was a lot of debate about that in terms of, well, it was studied in country A, but country B would be the first to have access to it. Is that really fair? So sometimes it's not even a socioeconomic conversation. It's a conversation about just the concept of volunteers in one geographic location volunteer their time, but then the drug is not available to that population for a very long time. Is that fair? So it can happen from a socioeconomic perspective. It can also happen just from a pure geographic location perspective. It can happen from, say, studies happening in the United States versus in other countries around the world. So it's a very very complex ethical issues that arise when you're dealing with drugs becoming available to the market, just generally.
Okay, and if we move on to the next one, informed consent. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because this is the most important way that a participant learns about what they're getting into when they volunteer to be for a research study, right? So informed consent is the term applied to being certain that the researcher has described what the purpose is, what the risks are, the potential benefits, what any costs are. And the responsibility of the participant in self-protection is to be sure they understand and they ask as many questions as they need to. So this is what you should know to be a participant in research. What is the study about and why is it appropriate for you? Why are you being asked to participate in this study? And what does it mean to be in the study? How many visits? How much time will it take? Will you have to miss work because of the amount of time it takes? What's the cost of participation and what's being paid for? Now, with the vaccine study that's coming up, there's in many of those studies, the investigators will offer to pay for parking. And for the inconvenience that comes up, although a person won't be paid to take the medication or the treatment. And we watch very carefully to be sure that we don't substitute money for safety. You also want to know what are the potential benefits and particularly what are the risks and side effects. In any investigational drug or vaccine, there are known and unknown risks, and we don't know what the unknown risks are. And we look to be sure that statement is put in every consent form so that participants know that we can tell you what we've learned from all the other people who've taken it. But because it's new, there are still some things that we might not know about. And so your responsibility there as a participant is to let your doctor know about anything that you experience, any change, any side effect, any feeling that you have that something is different. That's your responsibility. And actually, that's how we learn about how drugs, what the other risks are or what the other side effects are. And you also need to know as a participant what other treatments or options are available, right? So that you can make an informed choice. Now, right now with the vaccine, what we're going to be told is if I volunteered for the vaccine study, there are no other options right now to prevent someone from getting COVID, except following all the guidelines as closely as we can. But sometimes in cancer treatments, there are other treatments that might be available, and you need to know that. Okay, and then the next slide.
Madeline, just before
yeah.
we go to the next slide, again, you're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show, and it's really so great to have two experts up here with me, Madeline Nosky and Linda Coleman. My question is, just from a layperson standpoint, anyone that takes medication, even after a medication is on the market and it's been on the market for a while, when you look on the bottle, it says, these are the possible side effects. So even after the research, and I'm not trying, this is not a curveball or a challenging question, but even after the research and the marketplace use, still there are warnings on even just what's been approved.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And Tom, you're also right in picking up after a drug is approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and it goes out to large market, often they add a new risk that they didn't see in the research. The black box warning, they often call it, right? Because as more people use it, more is learned about a drug. We are all different. Our bodies and our physiology and our response to medication is different. And so the more people that take it, the medication, the more we learn about it. We're always learning about side effects. And that's why the FDA keeps updating the package inserts or the warnings as they learn it.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's what makes this might sound like I'm just preaching to the choir, but that's what makes this show so exciting to me, that we are a walking experiment, just the human nature, human civilization. And to have people that are concerned and working toward our beneficence, I'm gonna have to practice that word now. I like that word, beneficence. It's just key. So again, Linda and Madeline, thank you so much for being here. But continue.
I was going to add something to your last point, Madeline, too, and I think that's really why it's so important that we have a diverse group of individuals participating in research, for as long as it's appropriate. Because of the reason that Madeline just described, that when drugs do come to market, build risks, and that over time, new risks are learned. So the more you can learn before it gets to market, the better, right? And so if you're only studying a drug on one population or age group or whatever it might be, that's really going to have an impact, when it does come to market, in terms of how it could really translate in the community. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. And this slide is just it's kind of a cartooning way to say this. Scientists, investigators, and even doctors are used to talking to each other. And so often there's a lot of jargon that's used. And when a participant joins, it isn't that the participant isn't as smart as the doctors and the researchers. It's just a different language. The responsibility is to ask questions. Ask until you understand. No question is stupid. Keep asking and keep reporting anything you feel is different, because you're part of the research team as a participant. And Linda, we can skip the next slide and just go to the part that you're going to talk about. This was just saying the same thing. Ask questions.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to mention just a couple of things. I won't read this entire slide, but we've talked about the Belmont report, right? That was published. And again, I wanted to mention that there were regulations were passed following that required researchers to get voluntary consent from people and to require the use of institutional review boards. So the whole point of just discussing this, we already mentioned, is that what came out of the Belmont report, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, was the fact that it kind of paved the way for all of the regulations. It paved the way for the use of institutional review boards, and it's in its authority to review and approve or disapprove a study, just to make sure it is ensure that the ethical protection of human participants and in compliance with all the laws and regulations and human research standards. And I just wanted to mention that since that time, since the 70s, or, since the Belmont Report, and even the US regulations, there are many laws, regulations, and standards around the world. So currently there are over 1,000 laws, regulations, and guidelines that govern human subject protection in 133 countries, as well as standards from a number of international and regional organizations. So that means that it's not just the FDA, right? Like Health Canada, they have a regulatory body and they have a whole process. The European Medicine Agency, they have in India, South Africa, China, Japan, in Latin America, and other African countries. It's just grown significantly. And there's actually a document that is published annually that lists for every single country all of the human research standards and requirements that you can go to. So if you're doing research, say in Brazil, you can go to this document and you can see what all of the requirements are for that particular country. And for the United States, same thing. So it's really changed how we do research around the world. And then one other thing, just generally, I just would say is in terms of how we conduct research, there is something called the an international standard for how to conduct research. So it's not just the ethical standards, but it's also important to try to do things as much as possible the same way. Because in a lot of these trials, especially these clinical trials, we're talking about for vaccines, those kinds of things, you're doing them globally. And so you want to do them the same way because it's going to be used, globally in a lot of these drugs. And then,
if I might, this is really a key important point. Well, everything you've mentioned, both you and Madeline have mentioned, is really key. But we hear a lot in the rumor mill, in the internet world, in the conspiracy world, about parts of some countries in Africa in particular, big pharma taking advantage of people not being informed, research being conducted not in compliance with these standards. Would you like to comment on that a little bit?
Sure, I can try to. I mean, I know there have been a few really kind of more famous cases or studies that have occurred. And this is kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier. And again, I'm not an expert on all of them, but where research is being conducted in a particular country, especially in a poorer country, and then the benefit of the research once the drug comes to market is not available to that population because they can't afford it. Or a situation where say a sponsor goes into a country and they put in all this infrastructure for the research. And so people are having they're feeling like, I want to participate in the research because maybe they don't have access to medical care. So this is their only opportunity to have access to medical care. And then all of a sudden the study is over and then they leave. So these are kinds of ethical debates that have happened that can occur. Now I will say that, Yale University, we do have studies that happen that we review for a global from some global research, but in terms of clinical trials per se, each country has some of their own regulatory requirements, and so we typically aren't overseeing those kinds of studies in those countries. We basically focus on studies in the United States. The other research we might do that's like more social behavioral and some of those other types of things, and Madeline, you serve on that committee. We do all kinds of very interesting research in other countries, but it's a little bit different. And then we usually partner with a local institution, or we try to get as much information as possible regarding what the requirements are, so that we're not imposing our U.S.-centric views on that country, and we are very respectful of some of the local considerations that are happening there. So I can say that generally, but that's kind of how that works.
Thank you.
Okay. Just quickly, I just wanted to mention also, because research is so complex and it's not just about the IRB, I think that there was this realization that when you're trying to do research, there are a lot of people or stakeholders, I should say, that are really important in the process. And so, for example, what I would say is that, for example, Tisha Johnson's on the phone, and there's a Yale Center for Clinical Investigation. So even though, I'm the director of the Human Research Protection Program, I mean, I don't oversee everything that's happening on campus. There's no way I could do that. I have this small part of it. but I have to collaborate with Tisha Johnson all the time on clinical trial related issues in terms of, how it's being conducted, how our researchers are doing. We work together on lots of initiatives to just make sure that research is being conducted in an ethical and in an appropriate manner, is done in a quality way, all those kinds of things. There are things like when doing international research, there's export controls. You've got things like conflict of interest, which is another complex topic that probably we don't have a lot of time to get into, but there's lots of contracting. There's all these different groups that play a role in research. So I just wanted to point that out. And so there's this accrediting body in the United States. It's called the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs. And they set these standards for how a program should operate so they can work together effectively. It's an independent organization. It's voluntary for us to participate, but we've chosen to do so because it really illustrates, if you do get accredited, which Yale is, it really it sort of demonstrates that we are meeting rigorous quality and human research protection standards. So just so you be aware, Yale is fully accredited and was last accredited or reaccredited in 2019, and it's a 5-year cycle that we go through, and it's quite very it's a very long process that we go through, and everyone's involved. So it's not just the IRB office, it's all the researchers have to get interviewed. Not all, but they select researchers to interview. They interview our IRB members, our staff, Tisha and others they kind of ask you questions to see how you're doing. They want to make sure you understand the regulations. They want to understand you're following processes. They want to make sure you're protecting human subjects. So it's a really important piece of a human research protection program. And just as I mentioned, there's these 3 groups. You've got the IRB is one part of it. And then you've got your researcher and research teams, and then the rest of the institution or, your university, which is what I was mentioning there. So I cut you off. I'm sorry, Tom, you were going to ask a question.
No. You just sparked. I thought I could just sit back and listen, but you guys just keep on stimulating my brain. Are you saying that because of COVID, even research moving forward might be more complicated? I'm thinking of people that are asymptomatic. In terms of and Madeline's referenced the flexibility and plasticity of the human body. Is this COVID medical issue now even opened up not a Pandora's box, but even maybe has made medical research even more complicated in terms of what the host body is now bringing to the party? To use a bad expression.
Yeah.
I would say yes on Mel. I'll let you comment as well, but I was going to say that that's really taught us that as an organization, as a university, and the health system, which is not part of the university per se, but our researchers do research in our health system. We all need to work together very closely to help manage research, right? Because we can't do all the things we normally do. For example, we had to, as a university, because of what happened with COVID or the pandemic that's happening now, we've had to make decisions about what research could continue, what had to stop temporarily. All those kinds of things are related to human research generally. We were on the phone talking with each other constantly and having meetings constantly to make sure that we are still making sure that those studies that have a therapeutic or what we call a prospective direct benefit, which is basically that it's a therapeutic kind of a study for people can stay open. What can we do to make sure those can stay open safely? And which ones can we potentially pause, and how can we now, reopen those studies? So it teaches you that it's not just one person or one department that runs all of this. It's not just the IRB. It's all of us as a group. We have to be very functional and work together to figure out how we can keep research moving forward, but also protect the public and protect our research participants and our staff and all of us here on the phone as well. We want to make sure we do everything safely.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, when we talked about how research is never free of all risks, if we wanted to say because of COVID, we'll just shut down all of the research, we think of the persons out there who are suffering from cancer who would benefit from participating in some of the projects looking at new drugs. So it's always a set of trade-offs, and we want the safest trade-offs. And the university and the hospital have come up with ways to protect participants from exposure to COVID and to protect researchers. So that's a whole other layer that we didn't have to deal with before. So Tom, you're exactly right. It did make it more complicated.
So this last slide here, I think this is the last slide. And actually, before I go to this last slide, I wanted to comment and just really emphasize that last point as well. It's just that's really shown us that, you know, we talked about working together, and as Madeline mentioned, there's so many types of research studies that are can be so beneficial to people. And when Madeline mentioned that there are measures that you can do to continue research, I'll give you some examples. So with informed consent, we're used to using a paper document, right, and having a conversation face to face in the same room. Well, because of technology and those kinds of things, there are other ways potentially of having that conversation. And we have a video capability and all kinds of things. I know on the healthcare side, they've done the same thing. You know, I know that may not be as preferable than seeing your doctor, but, you know, I've had video visits, you know, with my doctor, and the same thing in research. Or how do you get the, you know, drugs that you're using in a study to someone? There are ways of doing that meet the regulations, and you can do that. Or, you know, how do you get your blood draw? So again, all those things the university had to think about. Really, Tisha's group, the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, did a great job figuring all that out. And then how can you help the researchers manage all that? So COVID has taught us a lot. And it's really an opportunity actually to kind of move research forward even more. So what can we learn from that? So as Madeline mentioned, you know, things like maybe if you do your research between 9 to 5 every day, you know, your research is only available, you go into the clinic or to an office between 9 and 5. Well, maybe the fact that you're more flexible and able to do things after hours or using other mechanisms, maybe that will expand the reach or opportunities for people. At the same time, of course, for those people who don't maybe like technology, how do you manage that? And there might be some innovative ways we can help figure out how do we still support people in that regard if they're not comfortable with that. So that's all these things that we're talking about and learning. So this last slide is really more just, you know, the fact that I talked about YCCI, the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, you know, is so involved in all of these local, national, and global efforts involving the community, and how the community, individuals and the community are so important to research, this whole thing. We can't do this without that type of conversation. And I just want to mention that our office, including the IRB, is very involved sometimes. We're invited to participate in some of these efforts. And, you know, we're very, always very willing and, you know, to help with explaining, you know, if we have a particular study that we're working on, you know, working with the community to ask questions, get feedback. You know, if we're struggling with a recruitment issue, like how do we do something? I know Madeline calls me or emails me and says, you know, can we have a consultation with our community ambassadors about how to do this? We're often on the phone with Tisha and others in group to talk about, you know, how should we do this, because we're not quite sure. The informed consent is always a big thing. We do training and presentations. So just to kind of give an idea again, just to sort of emphasize that we all work together to try to make research as safe as possible and as accessible as possible for people in the community.
What's the best way if someone's, again, because we will widely share and disseminate the link to the show, and shout out to WNHH. This is my 5th year of being on the station on Mondays. But if folks want to get involved, if they want to know about research, share the word, spread the word, be a Johnny Appleseed kind of thing, what's the best link for them or best website for them to go to? Should they go to just YCCI or?
Well, you know what, there's a couple of ways. I know that there's the YCCI link, and I know that if people are involved with the Yale New Haven Health System piece of it, you know, and they're using my chart. I know that there are ways, there are links on when you go to your page. I know I go to my page, it'll prompt me in terms of whether or not I want to learn more about research. So that's one way of getting information about it. Of course, if you don't want to participate in research, it allows you to opt out and say you don't want to do that either. So of course, not everyone may feel comfortable doing that. That's one way. And I know that YCCI, and I might have to defer on the location. They have links as well, and we're happy to share those links maybe after this call, after this this program, to kind of give you that information so you can share it with the community. I just don't have the exact links or memorized.
Linda, actually, if you go right down, just skip the next slide and go to the third one. You did put the link on. Go one more. One more. There. So that's the YCCI link.
We did do it. Okay. Thank you.
And you can, as long as you have the one link,
yes,
that's the entry into learning about all the other studies.
Yes.
There are also advertisements that you'll see. And in most of those, you'll see that the IRB has reviewed those. There are flyers that are often around, billboards that are often around. If you're interested, though, I would start with YCCI.
Yes.
And the cultural ambassadors are a major asset to the community.
Harry's going to give us the hook in a second, but I tend to ask tough questions when we only have 10 seconds to go. But I want to pose the question. There are people today, parents today, that are reluctant to have their son or daughter get whatever vaccines they need to get to enter kindergarten. What do you say to that population? And I'm not trying to be judgmental about their individual choices, but given your commitment, Madeline and Linda, to the health professions, the people's beneficence, what do you say to a parent that's reluctant to get the requisite vaccines and inoculation for their young person?
Well, as a mother of two sons, I always deferred to my pediatrician. And what I think is there are many ideas out there, and there are many views that people have. But pediatricians take an oath to care for their patients. They're the best informed about it. I think most of them would recommend the vaccines. And I know one area that I did delve into was, at times in the past, there was an idea that vaccines were linked to autism, and that has been dispelled with good, solid research. And I know parents want to do the best for their children, and I know they need to decide. But I recommend that parents go to their pediatricians.
Great.
Can I just add one other thing? On the YCCI website, I refer your listeners to clinical trials. If they go to the website and then click on clinical trials, they'll see all the different research that's available.
Excellent. Linda, you have 10 seconds.
I was just going to say one thing I want to just emphasize again, the importance of our cultural ambassador program. Mm-hmm. And I know I talked about YCCI, and I think that is really an important piece to making sure that the community, in terms of representing community interest, that they're represented. In terms of questions, we defer to them so many times for assistance in research studies.
Excellent. Harry has indicated to me that we're going to get the hook. I just want to again thank you, Madeline and Linda.
Thank you, Tom.
Tisha, I will get Tisha to speak next time. She's yours today. Reverend Perry, thanks for looking in. And thank you, everybody, for keeping hope alive.
Better watch the way you're going. Better go in the right direction. In the moment you're stressing, but you're going to be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, because they ain't ready for your final version. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up.